informing us about the influence of Spanish culture in the Philippines.
And the song you're hearing is the start of a song called Tinikling, which is the national dance of the Philippines. And this music is a result of the Spanish colonization. And it's apparently very similar to Spanish. It's called rondalia, and it's very similar to Spanish music. Okay, my name is Garcia, and I did the Hispanization of the Philippines. And I took a look at religion, language, and architecture. Each of these I could have gone into a very long paper on each of the topics, but I tried to bring them down into something that was just a general look, but gave you an idea of Spanish influence in each of these areas. And this is my table of contents. I'm going to talk about prehistory of the Philippines very briefly, contact with the Spanish, discovery, Philippine natives, two groups, Aitas, and the Indonesians and Malaysians, which I've grouped together. I'll explain why a little bit later. A map of the Austronesian people, and I'll explain that also. Christian religion, Filipino Catholicism, and some of the characteristics that I've found through my research about it, mostly pertaining to the period of colonization. Language, Philippine Spanish, and a dialect, a Creole dialect called Chabacano, and architecture, a little bit about native architecture, the architecture of the colonial houses, church architecture, and then finally my conclusion. And I decided to do this project because it's kind of a tribute to my heritage. It's a way for me to teach you all and people who are reading, going through my capstone and all that, a little bit about something they may not have known about the Philippines. I felt that a lot of people don't really know very much about it, and I've discovered in classes about Spanish history and Latin American history that it's not really talked about very much. It's just mostly glossed over in textbooks and things like that. And I felt that it was very important to understanding Spanish colonization and Latin American history, especially because it pertains a lot to Mexico as well. And this is prehistory of the Philippines and contact with the Spanish. And discovery and colonization in the Philippines. This is very brief. I could have gone on for probably 3 or 4 slides on this, but this just gives you a general idea of how it went. The Philippines was discovered in the year 1521 by the Spanish. They came from Mexico, from Acapulco, and they sailed west, hitting first Guam, and then sailing through the central area of the Philippines called the Visayas. And Magellan, who was heading that expedition, landed on the island of Cebu, and he met with the king, and they're not really kings, it's more like a chieftain, but it was the Datu of Cebu, and he converted the Datu and his wife to Christianity. And Magellan made a big mistake of getting involved with a local rivalry between the king of Cebu and his rival, King Lapu-Lapu. And Lapu-Lapu actually killed Magellan, so he never made it actually around the world. But the Spanish were able to take over, and in 1565 they finally colonized the islands, and they began the galleon trade. They're called the Manila galleons, and that began in 1565. And it was mostly to trade silks and ceramics from China, because Chinese merchants had set up shop in the Philippines already, and it was just a jumping point off to get to China. And colonization lasted for about 300 years. And this is about Philippine natives. 2 groups, the Negritos, which are the Aita, and the Indonesians and Malaysians. And that's a picture from the Boxer Codex, Chinese artist, but it was drawn for the Spanish, and that shows Visayans with their tattoos. Aitas. They were called negritos or negrillos by the Spanish. A lot of Filipinos today call them negritos, but they have native names. Aita, Ati, Aita, Akta, Ata, and Ita. They're the original people of the islands, and they're not related to the Asian Filipinos. They're more closely related to the people from Papua New Guinea and Melanesia. And their culture is of the New Stone Age, and it's very simple. When the Spanish came, or actually when the Indonesians, Malaysians came, they hadn't started agriculture and they hadn't begun constructing complex buildings, or at least as complex as Indonesians and Malaysians. And after the arrival of the Indonesians and Malaysians, they slowly lost their own languages. So now they speak languages that are closely related to or are of their neighbors, wherever they live. And the Indonesians and Malaysians, I grouped them together because the culture and languages are very closely related. So I felt it would take up too much time to talk about both separately. They came after the Aitas, and they took, a lot of times by force, the land from the Aitas and forced them up into the mountains. And they control most of the valleys in the mountains and also the coasts. And the culture was more advanced than the Aitas. They constructed buildings, they had agriculture, they used metals like copper and gold, and they also had shipbuilding skills. And they're part of a group called Austronesian by linguists, which is also partly cultural, because all of them share similar cultural items if you look at the base. And the whole region stretches from Madagascar out to New Zealand and up to Hawaii. And this is a map of it. You can see Madagascar is not really that close to Australia. It's actually off the coast of Africa. But you can see how it stretches up. Philippines is right here. Indonesia, Malaysia, Marianas, Hawaii is up here. Easter Island's all the way out here. And that's just about 2,000 miles off the coast of Chile. And then you have New Zealand at the bottom. And before I go on, I thought it would be pertinent to explain what Hispanization is. This is my own definition, and I thought that it explained it fairly well. It's the way in which a culture, after contact with the Spanish, gains elements from Spanish culture. It can be religion, language, music, dances, and other various things. And it should be sufficient enough so that the resulting culture is considered mestizo, which means mixed to both the native and the Spanish. And this is a picture of mestizo women, and they're wearing traditional outfits. And this is about Christian religion, Filipino Catholicism. And this is actually a picture from the Doctrina Cristiana, and it was the first book published in the Philippines, and that was in the 1500s. Not sure by the date there. But it was the Christian doctrine. That's what it means. And this is characteristics of Filipino Catholicism. This is just the main points that I found that were fairly unique to the islands. About 70% of Filipinos are Catholic, Roman Catholic. During colonization, there were three significant festivals: Holy Week, Corpus Christi, and the festival in honor of the patron saint of whatever town the people lived in. And one very interesting thing was there was a very great demand for holy water at first, partly because going through the books that I read, the babailanes, which were the curanderas, most of their job was to cure sickness or to prevent it, and holy water kind of was believed to take that role. And singing was also very important to pre-Hispanic Filipinos, and it's still very important today. The Spanish noticed that the Filipinos took very well to music, playing instruments, and singing, and they actually offered free lessons to Filipinos. And also, co-parenthood, which is godparents, was very important, and I felt that it was similar to the system called barangay, which was part family, a kinship relationship, social relationship, and political. And it works kind of the same way because you have big networks of godparents and things like that, and you have like backup. So I felt it was very similar. There's also a great feeling of the mysterious and the miraculous in popular Catholicism in the Philippines. And it's evidenced by pre-Hispanic beliefs which coexist with the Christian beliefs, such as spirits that are believed to exist everywhere, called Anito. And that was the actual name for the spirits before the Spanish came. And they were believed to live in strange trees, weird groves, odd rock formations in caves, things like that. Language. This is about Philippine Spanish and the Creole dialect called Chabacano, and that's actually a sample of Chabacano right there. Philippine Spanish. It's more or less pure Castilian. There's very little influence from the native languages, which is very strange for a language that has, for a Spanish language. Mostly because the people who spoke it were landowners or they had businesses and they looked down on the native languages, and speakers of Philippine Spanish today still do. At its height, it was spoken by only about 10% of the population. Right now, it's only about 2% now. And actually, my grandmother says that her grandmother was Spanish and actually spoke it. But she kind of had the reverse. She actually got made fun of in her village for speaking Spanish by the people, so she didn't speak it to my grandmother or my grandmother's parents. It's very aristocratic, very precise, and very conservative. It has some features that are old. I wasn't able to find very many. Actually, I couldn't find any that really explained the old feeling of it. But with the sounds of B, G, and D don't fricativize, which means they don't take on a softer feel. They remain their very hard sound. And that's contrast with other varieties of Spanish, which actually do that. If you listen to a Spanish speaker and a Philippine Spanish speaker, you'll hear the difference. D, the sound for the letter D has very interesting, has interesting things that happen to it. It sometimes sounds similar to the Spanish R, especially between vowels, or sometimes it's lost, such as in the ending ado, which becomes, for instance, cuidado becomes cuidao. And there's actually an H sound pronounced in most varieties of Spanish. Where you see an initial H in a written word, it's not pronounced. But in certain words, in Old Spanish, the letter F in certain instances changed to the H sound. And Philippine Spanish actually conserves that. So, for instance, the word for ant is hormiga, not hormiga. And that actually came from Latin, formica. Double L is pronounced as in Spain. So the word for towel, which would be pronounced toalla, in Latin America is toalla in Philippine Spanish, and also in a lot of varieties of Spanish on the peninsula. And one influence from the native languages that has worked its way in is where there's an F sound normally in Spanish, there's a P sound said. So, like the word clarificación is clarificación. And Chabacano, it's a Creole dialect, and it sprung up around the military barracks. Most of the northern varieties, which are Caviteño, Ermitaño, and Ternateño, they actually originate from Ternateño, which comes from the island of Ternate in Indonesia. And they actually had moved up to the Philippines and started the village of the city of Ternate. The vocabulary is, for the most part, Spanish, but in contrast with Philippine Spanish, there's a lot of native words that have been mixed in, usages, things like that. And my friend Liz actually spoke it, and it's very interesting to hear. You can kind of understand what she's saying, but not quite. It sounds very odd to a Spanish speaker. And some of the characteristics that are unique is that the verbs only have one form, and they descend from the infinitive form. So the word for to walk is andar, and that comes from andar. And there's only one article because there's no genders. So the article el goes for both feminine words and masculine words. And a final interesting thing is that the word cosa, which means thing in Spanish, actually has become kind of a general interrogative. So if you want to say, what is it? You say cosa es. Architecture. This is actually a picture of native housing. It's a village. This was taken probably about 1900s. And I'm going to talk about native architecture, colonial houses, and religious architecture. So, native architecture. It's called Bahay Kubo. And in general, it's totally built of natural materials. You don't have anything like nails holding together. It's the housing for most of the poorer people. My grandmother grew up in one of those. And it's not often seen except for out in the villages out in the country. And colonial houses, it's called Bahay Nabato, which means house of stone. And it has different influences: Chinese, native, Spanish. The first floor is for keeping things, storage, and the second floor is for living. And that's a picture of one. And they're made of stone and wood. The roofs are made of tiles, thatching, or galvanized steel. And religious architecture. It came to the Philippines through Mexico, and it's Antillean style, the Antilles, which are the Caribbean islands. I found about 4 or 5 main styles: Baroque, Neoclassic, Renaissance, Neo-Romanesque, and Gothic. Not very much on Gothic though. And influences are Spanish. There's some Mexican influences, native, and Asian. Baroque. Simple, yet very florid and fancy. This is Nabrakan, which is in Ilocos, and that was constructed in 1701. Neoclassic, a lot simpler, influenced by Roman and Greek architecture. Renaissance, very similar, a little bit simpler than the Neoclassic. And this is Las Piñas Church, New Romanesque. This is the Cathedral of Manila, and it evokes a feeling of ancient Roman architecture and Italian. A lot of the churches in Italy are of that style. And let's see. And this is an example of a church that has no definite style, and it has Asian, Muslim, Spanish, various different feelings. It's hard to classify. And this is Pauay. And conclusion. I felt the Philippines was a mestizo culture. Not fully through language, but through other things like I've shown, architecture, and religion. And I feel that it's as important as other to talk about. I feel that the Philippines should be discussed along with Latin American countries when you're talking about the history of Spanish colonization, more than just little snippets about Spain goes here and then colonizes. And for me, I learned a lot, mostly about the different varieties of churches, things like that, the aspects of Filipino Catholicism that I really didn't know. I knew a lot, but I wanted to share that with you guys, just to open up your horizons a little bit. So, and that's it. This is actually a story that actually isn't quite right. Is that the Spanish made the Filipinos wear it because they couldn't hide things under it, because as you can see through it. And there are no pockets because they didn't want people hiding anything in there. But actually, it's because the style is taken from the guayabera, which is a shirt that you see a lot of Cubans or Donaldo wearing. And this is always long-sleeved, except for this type called the polo barong, which is a short-sleeve version in cotton that's embroidered, and it looks a lot like what Donald's wearing. This is actually usually made of a cloth called sinamay, which is pineapple fiber, and I was telling Ana Maria earlier that you scrape off the cuticle of the leaf, you take the fibers out, and then you have to knot each one into a thread, and then you have to weave it. And the fabric can be very expensive. This is actually raw silk. So this is a silk shirt, and it's annoying to iron and all that. I was doing it last night. I still haven't gotten all the wrinkles out, and you can see it wrinkles very easily. But embroidery is a very important part of it. It actually is what makes the shirt look like it does. You have different styles. You have all over. You have stripes of it called raya, which would be kind of what Janelle's wearing. And you get various designs. A lot of people will have theirs designed for them by the tailor. I actually bought this one online, so if you want one, you can go buy one online. And this is considered the equivalent of a suit and tie. And it actually makes a lot of sense in the Philippines because the weather there being about 8 degrees, humid, tropical, you don't want to wear a suit, a wool suit especially in the Philippines. And this lets air through. And you don't wear this without a shirt underneath it because then you see, you might as well go shirtless then. And I traditionally you wear a white shirt under it, but I wore a black one so you could actually see all the embroidery on it. And these can run between about $50 all the way up to $400, depending on how much embroidery is on it, and if it's made out of sinamay or not.